Hello S1, welcome to the second lesson that is linked to your poem Flannan Isle. In this lesson we are going to look at Flannan Isle in a little bit more detail and look at the technical side to the poem. So we're going to have a bit of a break from the mystery, but I'm hoping you've got some really good ideas about what might have happened to the men in Flannan Isle, and we're going to look at how the poem is written. We're going to think about the effects created by the poem and discuss our personal response to the poem, not just in this lesson, but throughout the next few lessons. Just as a reminder of the technical words, a stanza refers to a unit or section of poetry, like a paragraph or a verse if you were talking about song. The rhyming scheme is linked to the pattern of rhyme in the poem. Word choice refers to particular words chosen because of the effect they create. Imagery is to do with metaphors, similes and personification. Tone is linked to the speaker's attitude, so how the speaker is feeling, whereas mood and atmosphere is linked to all the techniques used to make you feel a certain way. So you already know the main ideas, but now we're going to look at the rhyming scheme of the poem. Now, I did have a QR code on here that was generated by PowerPoint, but it doesn't seem to be working, so I do apologise about that. I'll put the link to the website that I want you to look at onto your team. However, the website, I'll just go over some highlights. It's from a website called eNotes, and it just talks about why rhyming schemes are important. Well, the main reason why it's important is because the rhyming scheme affects the way you perceive the poem. So the way that you think about the poem. So if I give you an example, hopefully some of you have heard of a limerick. Now a limerick is quite a fun type of poem, and it's got a really structured rhyme scheme, but it also has a really structured rhythm to it as well. And it's got a rhyme scheme of A, A, B, B, A. So the first and the second lines rhyme, then the next two lines, they rhyme with each other, but not with the first two. And then the final line rhymes with the first two again, A, A, B, B, A. So I'll just give you a wee example just now. There was an old man from Peru who had a big snake in his shoe. He had such a fright when it gave a bite, so he hopped all the way to the zoo. Now, that rhyme scheme makes everything sound really fun, bouncy, almost childlike. And that gives you an idea of the kind of poem that it's supposed to be. It's meant to be a fun poem with a sort of daft story in amongst it, and it's just meant to be enjoyed. Whereas you have other poems that are completely different. You'll study a poem in S3 potentially called Midterm Break, and that poem has almost no rhyme in it apart from the very end, and I'll talk to you about that in a minute. And that poem is all about a little boy having to go home for a funeral, and he realises, or we realise later on in the poem, that the funeral is actually of his little brother. And the very last lines rhyme, which is quite strange because the rest of the poem doesn't. And so what happens is the rest of the poem feels really sombre, really sad, makes you think about all the different things that's happening to this narrator as he's in the funeral. But because the last two lines rhyme, they stick out and they're very memorable. And it's because it's in that moment that it's revealed that the victim, the person that's dead, is actually his little brother. And it has a few different effects by doing that. So for example, it suddenly sounds like a bit like a nursery rhyme, and the little brother that died was only 4. So it makes you think about him as an innocent child. But it also, here's a fancy word for you, it also resonates. And what that means is it leaves it with you. You can't get those lines out of your head. So rhyme is really important, and we're going to look today about how you manage to identify a rhyme scheme in a poem and think about it in more detail. And Flannan Isle, I have to say, is quite a difficult poem to work out exactly what the rhyme scheme is, because one of the things you have to remember is that your accent will change the rhyme. So by the end of this lesson, you might not all have the exact same rhyme scheme, and that's why you're going to have a class discussion at the end of this lesson to come up to see who came up with what sort of rhyme scheme. So the way to work out a rhyme scheme is quite simple. You use the alphabet. So the very first line in any poem is always given the letter A. Will three men dwell on Flannan Isle? That gets an A. To keep the lamp alight? That gets a B. As we steered under the lee we caught? Well, that gets a C because it doesn't rhyme with isle or alight. No glimmer through the night. Now, night rhymes with a light, so that gets a B. So far we've got A, B, C, B. So what I would like you to do is go into your OneNotes. You will find a copy of the poem and I'll put on Teams where to find it. And I would like you to use just the typing features on OneNote or your finger, if that's easy enough to do, and just come up with the rhyme scheme for the poem as a whole. Now, what I want you to think about once you've done that is there a really clear rhyme scheme? So the rhyme scheme is the pattern. So the A's and the B's and the C's and the D's and so on. Do they make a pattern? Is there no rhyme at all? So it just goes A, B, C, D, E, F, G. In which case that would be known as free verse or blank verse. Or is there a mixture of the two? Like the poem I told you about earlier, like Midterm Break, where you have some lines that rhyme and others that don't. And what you might find is that when they rhyme, they tend to be more important lines. So have a go, and at the end of that, I want you to have a class discussion about the rhyming scheme in Flannan Isle. And you'll see on the next slide down, there is a box that I want you to type into in your OneNote. And I want you to type in just the notes from your class discussion. What is the rhyme scheme of Flannan Isle? What effects are created by this rhyme scheme? In other words, does this rhyme scheme impact in any way on how you feel about the poem? If you've got any questions at all, you can tag me. Probably the easiest thing to do is if you go onto the S1 team and just tag me there and ask a question, and I'll be able to come back to you. Have fun!